Yeah, mothballs. Put mothballs in your ears and you won't have a problem with moths. One of the things we're going to talk about, first of all, let's just really briefly go over what we talked about last week. First of all, we talked about what was sound, what are sound waves. We had pictures of sound waves. We talked about the distance between sound waves. We talked about the height and the lows. When the sound waves are closer together, what does that mean?
Higher pitch.
There you go. When the sound waves are farther apart, what does that mean? Lower pitch. Good. Very good. We talked about the inverse square law. What is the inverse square law? Do we remember? Why is that important? Inverse square law is the distance that sound travels. So, if you're in a big room and the distance from the front of the stage speakers to the person in the last room, for every 100 feet, you're going to lose 3 decibels of audio. So, it's important, especially not in a room like this, but when we get into big rooms, if you're in a room that has 800 people in it, by the time that sound comes out of that speaker and hits that last person, it's going to be less than what it is hitting the person in the front row. Therefore, you need to monitor both. Therefore, as a sound engineer, get up off your butt, get away from the console, and walk the room and listen to what you hear. So, because if the people up here are getting their head tore off and the people in the back can't hear, you're going to have problems. All right? We talked about how we measure sound. What is the measurement of sound in? Decibels. All right? And we talked about getting a decibel reader. Most human speaking that we're talking like right now is about 70, 78 decibels. When you get into your Sunday morning stuff, it's usually somewhere between 88 and 98. If you go to a rock concert or something like that, it's probably anywhere from 102 to 107. 120 will hurt you. 120 will ruin your hearing. So you got to be careful with that. We talked about what factors affect sound. What were some of the things we talked about? Yeah, very good. Salinity, moisture, hot and cold temperatures. Yep, when we get into, like it's storming out right now, if we were to be outside and it was raining, the sound system would sound totally different than if it was just completely sunny outside. Why? Because speakers are made out of paper. Paper absorbs humidity. They become heavier. It takes more power for that voice coil to move in the speaker when the speakers are heavy. So it will change the way that they sound. Frequencies. We talked about frequencies. I gave you guys all a handout, I hope you still have it, of a keyboard. That's going to become your, for lack of a better word, your sound Bible. All right? You learn those frequencies and you will become one of the best sound guys there is out there, because you're going to be able to sit there and say, here's that frequency, what is that note, how can I hear it, how can I fix it, okay? Hearing versus listening, all right? And what we talked about in hearing versus listening, just because you have all the faders up and everything's on, you got to listen to what's happening within the music. You have to listen to what's happening within your pastor. What does his voice sound like? What's going on in the room? Hearing is about the moment. Listening is about the sound part of it. All right. So if you have a worship team and they're leading a really powerful ballad that doesn't need to be really loud, maybe it's really quiet acoustics, you need to be listening for that. You need to become the musician. You know, we talked about every worship team, or every church has a worship team, and each person has one part. If you're a singer, you have your part. If you're the tenor singer, you have a tenor part. If you have a bass player, you have a bass part. If you have a keyboard player, they have the keyboard part. They only have one part. You have all of them. So you need to be attuned to what's going on as the whole. Because the last church that I worked for as a full-time audio engineer, I had 118 inputs. That's 118 instruments coming in at one time. All right. Now they usually weren't all at the same time, but at any one time we could have had 118 instruments. I had a 160-piece choir. I had a 24-piece orchestra. All right. That's a lot of inputs. All right. All they had to know was one little part. You have to know everybody's part. You have to know what's going to make the bass guitar sound better, what's going to make the vocalist sound better. Why does some people's voices sound really shrill and other people's voices sound really warm? The nature of that. All of that goes into your mix. All that goes into factoring what you're doing in your mix. Don't be afraid to be the musician. We talked about that. We talked about listening to the songs, getting yourself ready before Sunday. Sunday is your on time, but also Sunday is warming up to Sunday. You shouldn't walk in here on Sunday morning late and then run to the console late and start mixing sound, because you're not going to be ready. Your head's not in the right place. Your ears aren't in the right place. You haven't got accustomed to the room yet. You haven't accustomed to the band. So when we become the musician, we have to take that stuff into consideration. We talked about coming in and finding a place for 5 minutes just to be quiet, just to get your head in the game, just to get your head ready to listen to sound. And then listen to your music director, listen to your choir director or worship leader, whatever. You know, they have a better idea of what they want your sound to sound like. Not every song is going to sound the same, and nor should they. If you listen to any kind of contemporary Christian music, especially today, no one song sounds the same. You have a feel of, you could have an old Baptist hymnal, you could have some of the new artists that are out there right now that are killing it in contemporary Christian music. All those songs sound differently, and you want to represent that. Now, you may not have the choir or the worship team that can reproduce all of that, but your job is to get it to sound as close to what it's supposed to be sounding like. So when a worship director or worship pastor picks a set of songs for the weekend, they're trying to convey a message. They're trying to convey what that message is, and it's usually tied to the pastor's message. What the pastor's preaching this week and the song should go together. All right? And so you need to listen. You need to have conversations. Maybe on your rehearsal night is what?
You can do it on
Wednesday?
Monday or Tuesdays.
Monday or Tuesdays? All right. So you guys need to know what their thought is. Well, how are we going into this? All right. So that's kind of the stuff that we picked up last week. Does anybody have any questions or any questions from last week that we didn't get answered? No? Okay. We talked about sound waves, what a sound wave looks like. We talked about the inverse square law. We talked about weights and measures. Why is it too loud? It's so loud in here. My ears are bleeding. Go to another church. Humidity, atmospheric pressure, heat, hot and cold. We talked about that. The salinity, refraction. We didn't burst on that. So what happens when we turn two speakers in at each other? They cancel each other out. All right, that's refraction. Same thing happens to a wall. So as these speakers come out and they hit that wall and the sound's going to come back, that's refraction. And there's parts of a wall. I was at a church this weekend, a brand new big Baptist church, huge Baptist church. And they built a stage in almost like a horseshoe or a U shape. And they put a wall 5 foot high around the whole back of the stage. So what did that create? That created a parabolic microphone. Who's ever watched a football game and the guy's running around with a little dish on the sideline with a microphone in it? And you can hear everything that's going on the field. That's called a parabolic microphone. Well, they built this church, and you could stand where I'm standing right now, and I could whisper, and people at the far end of the building could hear every single word that I said because the stage was creating this parabolic microphone. And it actually creates a big problem for them because they have an 8-piece praise team. They have an orchestra. They have percussion. They have timpani on stage. They have all this stuff going on. So when you start multiplying that, the room gets really live, gets really, really loud. And so they're actually having discussions right now about how do we dampen that area around us so that we don't have so much refraction on stage, so that what you hear is truly what you hear coming out of the speakers.
In downtown Tampa,
Yeah.
right by the river and the old Bank of America building,
Yeah.
there's a park there, and there's an old Coliseum or amphitheater.
Uh-huh.
I don't know what they ever use it for, but I don't know, it's all concrete, everything is kind of got round, but we always went there, and you could stand, and there was one square right in the middle of it.
You hear.
The thing would echo like crazy. The concrete, walk in there, and it sounded like you're in a closet.
How many people have gone to Mosey? Did you guys ever go to Mosey? All right, you ever gone to that? You ever see the little listening wall they have there at Mosey? So it's actually about 600 feet away, and you can walk in one little room, and all you do is speak into a pipe, and 600 feet away, there's the other end of the pipe, and it's really loud. That's part of being a parabolic microphone. That's part of what all of that is. A lot of that, and when we talk about refraction, you have to take in consideration, what does your room sound like? So we talked about you guys being in here. What do we have in here? 10 right now. What happens when there's 80 people in here? What changes in the room? The amount of power that it's going to take these speakers to cover those 80 people is going to be a lot more than it's going to take to cover 10 people. So when you come in on a Sunday morning and you sit down, you need to take a look at what's going on, who's sitting where, what's happening. You know, you probably have the same people that all churches have, where someone wants to be all the way over in that back corner and they don't want to talk to anybody, they don't want to socialize with anybody. You know, you still got to cover that area. You know, so when you're doing sound, you need to get up, go over there and see what that sounds like. Now, you always have the people who are going to sit up front here, and you know they want to be right in it.
Nobody sits there.
You know, that's true. It's true, especially if you put the tithing bucket here. Everybody runs away from the tithing bucket. We talked about frequency response. We talked about good and bad frequency responses. You know, what should your room look like? This is a sign of a bad frequency response. We talked about the highs and lows, and it should be as flat as possible. All right? Okay, next. We talked about this. This is the form that I give you guys. It should all, this is going to become your little audio Bible right here. If you can walk up to a keyboard and you can hit that keyboard and you can pick out that sound or on that keyboard, you're going to become so much more an effective audio engineer, because you know what they sound like. I know for a fact, after doing this I've been doing this 160 years, this right here is going to sound like right there, that's the note. So as you're listening to stuff and you go, man, why does he sound like so honky? Why does it sound like his nose plugged up? How come it sounds terrible? Well, I know that frequency in the 500 range is where that frequency is found. You either adjust more or take it away. All right? But memorizing this and you know, practical, especially on your guitar. Play it on your guitar, find the notes, find the frequencies. That's what it's all about. Hearing versus listening, we talked about this already. You know, center your focus. We talked about your ears being a muscle. We talked about going home and putting cotton balls in your ears, and just wake up the next morning, get ready to go to school, and you're gonna be like, why is everything so loud? I don't get it. You got to rest your ears. All right. Getting a good night's sleep, getting far away from the noise. We talked about finding 5 seconds around here to get away from everything. Know your frequencies. White space. White space, we talked about not every song, not every speaker has to be going 100% all the time. All right? Just because you have maybe 5, 10 instruments up here doesn't mean they all need to be going at the same volume at the same rate all the time. One of the things that's very effective is when you have space. When people speak, the best public speakers have air in their conversation. Same thing with your sound. Same thing with graphics on page. Same thing with a newspaper. There's always enough white space so that it's not all just, here it all is, because that's not mixing. All right? We talked about don't be afraid to be the musician. Phase 2, what we're going to talk about here, we're going to talk about all the faders are up and it sounds horrible and you don't know why. And some of that stuff is in your control, and a lot of that stuff is not in your control. So I liken it to this church we were at in Georgia this weekend. Bunch of the singers decided, you know, it was a good night to go party Saturday night. You know, Baptists don't party, I know. So they all went out and had a good time. They came in late Sunday morning, and it was like, I think I'm coming down with a cold. I can't sing. You're going to have to turn me up. You're going to have to turn up my mix, you know? Not the fact that, okay, we know for a fact that you were out to 2 a.m. singing and dancing. That had nothing to do with it. But, yeah. So know what you got going on as far as your people and what your surroundings are, and some of the things that go on with that. Know your gear. We're going to talk about knowing your gear. The difference between analog versus digital versus microphones versus pickups versus A guitar pickup will have different kinds of configurations for guitar pickups, whether EFI or whatever they are. They'll have different kinds of configurations. You need to know all about that. Again, he's playing one instrument. You have them all. It's your responsibility to make them all sound the best. Gain structure, that's the big one everybody wants to know about. What is gain structure and why is it important? When we start getting on the console and we start singing, as you guys come up and you guys mix, one of the things you're going to find out is, man, I've got the fader on, I got all the way cranked up, and I can't hear nothing. Or when I crank it all up, it's really noisy. Why is it really noisy? All right, we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about signal flow. How does coming out of a microphone, going into a cable, going into a snake, whether analog or digital, going to your console, in the console, what happens to it, going through preamps, going through summing amps, going through D to A converters, all of this stuff affects the final outcome that goes back out of the outputs to your speakers. All right, so there's a big chain, a flow chain of what's going on in you have to understand why is that important, because anywhere in that break that there's something different is going to change the way the sound sounds. Then we're going to go into cables. This is kind of a pet peeve of mine, and I in the college courses that I teach, I take everybody and I bring them in a room, and I literally have a pile of about 2.5 foot tall of cables. All right? Every kind of cable, electrical cables, microphone cables, speaker cables, RCA jacks, video cables, SDI cables, whatever kind of cable I can come up with, and I put them in a pile. And I make them all learn how to roll a cable, because the failure of 95% of all of the sound systems that are out there is when a cable breaks. And knowing how to take a cable and roll it and put it away properly and store it will save you thousands of dollars and a lot of headache. We're going to go over that. Then we're going to talk about resistance. Resistance is futile. You've probably heard that before, right? Resistance is how does that affect cabling? And that's pretty much what we're going to try to talk about tonight. Anybody? Yep, ohms resistance. So we'll get into that a little bit later when we start looking at the cable part of it. Why do I keep hitting the wrong button? Okay, the difference between mixing and science. Why does my mix sound so bad? And there's a lot of reasons for that. Nobody here, I guarantee you, if we all sat down on a console and we all had sound coming through it, nobody's mix would sound the same. I liken it to, everybody thinks they make the very best pizza in the world they've ever had. Of course, everybody else doesn't think your pizza's that hot. So, or spaghetti sauce, or whatever. So, same thing was with audio. So we're going to talk about, why is it bad? How do we fix it? We talked about being the musician. We're going to go over understanding gain structure, know your gear. We've already talked about that. Understanding microphones. Every microphone is designed for a specific purpose. There's no microphone out there that one microphone fits everything. A lot of churches will make the mistake of, we bought 10 SM58s, and that's the whole allotment we're going to have forever. And you don't put an SM58 in a kick drum, and you don't put it on a snare drum, and you may use it on a vocalist, but you don't use it for a hi-hat or a cymbal. So we're going to go over what microphones you need to do the job that you need to do it effectively. And keep your stage quiet. You guys, I don't see any amps on stage, so you guys are already good as far as that goes. Now you can run amplifiers on stage that are especially for guitar players. The amp doesn't make any noise. You're getting the sound of the tube and the preamp that's in there, and then you take a direct out, and we're going to go to the console with that. I have a lot of churches that do that, where they'll bring a little head in, and they'll play through the little amplifier head for the sound that they want to get, whether it's an orange amp or a Marshall amp or whatever, so they can get the sound in their ears that they want. But there's no sound coming out of the box at all. It's just a gain stage or a drive stage, okay? Building your mix. One of the things we're going to talk about is layering. So when you go in here, what's the one thing everybody wants to hear on top of all your mixes? Vocals. Yeah, the bass. Nobody wants to hear the
Low
bass.
end.
And there are people that want that. An effective engineer is gonna take all of that, and you're gonna layer this stuff. You're gonna find out. For me, after doing this for a lot of years, I start with vocals. I get my vocals where I want them to be. Everything else comes up underneath that. Because the worst thing you can do is sit in here with a group of people and they're like, we can't understand what they're saying. We can't understand what she's singing. What did she say? I didn't get that. So you need to work on layering your vocals. Your instruments, where do they belong in the mix? People tend to EQ instruments to death because as a guitar player, you know what you want your guitar to sound like, all right? And you work hard to get those tones. The sound engineer needs to know what you want your guitar to sound like so that you get those tones. Now, you're not going to come in with a 4-cabinet Marshall and a head on top of it and a Metallica sound where everything's overdriven to play in a Baptist church. You know, it's just not going to happen in this room. It may happen next door in the youth room, but it's not going to happen here. All right. So knowing those instruments, knowing what they're supposed to do, knowing what the sound is supposed to be. Getting your singers to listen to each other. One of the things we talked about, and this is going to go along with your music director and your choir or your whoever you have that sends up your vocalists. A lot of times vocalists, especially if they come in late, they're rushed. They couldn't get out of the house. They couldn't get their kids' clothes on. They're frustrated. They get here. Everybody's saying, we got to get there, we got to get there, we got to get there. Their head's not in the game. They tend to come in and they don't sing. All right, they come in and they're like, oh, la, la, la. Or we talked about the microphone being down around the chest, and they're not ready to sing. And so when you do your sound check and you go, okay, let's do our sound check, let's get our vocals, and they're all singing like this and they're not ready to go. Well, then they come out and they go through the front and they have 4 cups of coffee and a donut and sugar, and now they're ready to go. All right, so what happens? They're loud, all right? But you've already built your mix around what you heard up here, all right? So understand when you talk to your music director or you talk to your choir director or whatever you have in this position is they need to listen to themselves. If they're singing and their voice sticks out above everybody else's, they're singing too loud. They're not blending. You have to work on blending. You can do it technically on your console. All right, and that's your job. That's part of what you do. But you have to have a reasonable start point. You have to have an understanding of, we talked about before, I don't know if this microphone's still over here, we talked about the microphone being in a position, this is not singing. This right here is just a waste of time. I didn't learn my part. I forgot to study my part, and I don't know it, so I'm going to put it down here where nobody can hear me. Yes, exactly. Microphones go on the bottom of your chin. That's where they sound the best. So if it's your job politely and with grace to talk to the choir director, music director, or talk to the singer if there's nobody around and say, look, I need that microphone up on your chin. They're going to be like, well, I'm too loud. Let me worry about that. Let me do my job. I'll turn you down if you're too loud. All right, but if you don't give me enough to start with, I can't do my job correctly. All right, so when we talk about that, we talk about getting to know your singers. You all have singers, somebody comes in and you have singers that sing like this. They're on the mic on and it's really quiet and that's the way they sing. And then you have other singers that are going to be like this and they're going to be really, really loud. Know your singers. Set up your gain structure for those singers, okay? We're going to talk about dynamics. By dynamics, I don't mean like dynamic flow or anything like that. Dynamics in audio refers to compressors, limiters, things like that restrict or enhance the flow of audio through your console, all right? Very, very important. You can set up your console so if you have a compressor on a vocal channel, that no matter where they are with the singing, you can compensate for that. So if somebody starts off and they're talking like this, and then they get on it, your console will pick that up. And the console will squish it down a little bit so that everybody remains the same volume across the board as you're mixing. Okay? That's what I mean by dynamics. Again, we talked about white space. We don't need to go into that. Know your gear. Sound consoles. All different kinds of sound consoles. This is an analog console. This is a digital, or another analog console. This is a digital console. They do the same thing, but they do it entirely different ways. A digital console analog console, excuse me, will take a snake and we'll run a snake into the room like you have back there, and you're going to plug it in, and every single channel on an analog console does the same thing. Every single one of these does the same thing all the way across until here, all right? So knowing your gear, knowing the difference between analog and a digital. Digital console, any channel can be anything. I can put the left output over here and the bass over here and the singer over here, and it really doesn't matter. The main difference between analog consoles and digital consoles is the power conversion. So I talked about the chain where you go into a preamp in the console, and an analog console goes preamp to the channel and then the outputs. In a digital console, it goes from the preamp, the channel input, to the preamp to an A to D converter. So you have to convert audio to digital and then digital to audio. Then it goes to what's called a summing amp. And the summing amp takes the A to D conversion and puts it at a specific level that console wants to see. And then it's going to go into some kind of attenuator, electronic attenuator, also called DCAs. And we'll talk about that when we go on there. You guys all have DCAs on your console. And so what the DCA does is it allows you to take all of the vocals and bring them up or down. All of the drums, bring them up or down. All of the keyboard sends up and down. But it does it by voltage rather than by attenuation and like in a regular analog console. All right. This is an old analog snake. I think you guys have one of these probably in the wall.
Yeah, it doesn't look that good.
So these are about phased out. You can buy these for $12.55 just about anywhere on the marketplace right now because everybody's getting rid of them. This is a digital console. Typically, it's a console that will sit on stage up here, and we'll run Cat 6 back to the desk, and each one of these is capable of carrying. Each Cat 6 is capable of carrying 96 channels of information back to the console. So instead of having this big honking heavy snake with all of this plugs and everything like that, you've gone down to a Cat 6, that size. And if you put two of these together, they can still run on just one Cat 6 line. The church I did in Brandon at the Crossing, I had two of these. I ran 120 channels on each Cat 6 line. So you're saving a lot of space, a lot of time. It's a lot faster. It's a lot faster, but it has to be converted. You have to go from digital to audio and audio to digital. Okay? That's a digital snake. This is like two multi-snakes. You're going to get one of these on your stage. Or you may already have it.
Well, the other one you just had.
This is just two of those.
Okay.
So you can stack them, and the way they do it is there's on the back of this console, there's just a little Cat 6 to Cat 6 extension. So you can run one Cat 6 cable back there and then loop the two together, and you're done. You're done. Yeah. Here's your console. This is your Behringer Compact. This is what you guys have in the back right now. This is a digital console. Typically, when we mix, we want to mix everything left to right. So you have all your inputs on the left, then you go to a center section, which could be your DCAs, then you go to the very far right section, and that's usually your stereo outs, your mono outs, or whatever you want it to be. How are you going to go to your stream? What mixes it? So we talked about digital consoles being able to do just about anything. Any one of these channels here can be anything I tell it to be. So you're not restricted to, well, this channel's here, so it's got to go here. This channel's there, it's got to go there. So anything you do in here, and these channels, these boards store up to 99 presets per memory, and you get multiple memories. So you could come in here and say, I have a youth band in here, and they want to sound one way, and then I just want pastor on a vocal, and they're going to sound another way. And you can save those scenes, and I encourage you to save the scenes. So say you mix in here and you like how you mix, but you don't like the way he mixes. And that's going to happen. I can guarantee you that's going to happen. So what you do is you save your mix under your name and the date, and the next time you come in, you call up your mix, and everything is the way you like it already. That's why digital consoles are so effective. Are we having a party back there? So digital consoles are really, really important as far as the fact that you can customize them however you want to customize them. So we'll go into a little bit more as that. Microphones, SM81, SM57, SM58. This is, I don't even know what that is. It's like a biodynamics. These are condenser mics. There are microphones that are made for kick drums. There are microphones that are made for snare drums. There's microphones that are made for guitar amps. There are microphones made for vocals. There are microphones made for cymbals. So using the right microphone with the right cabling and the right setup on your console becomes really, really crucial. Cables. We're going to go into cables a little bit later, a lot more density, but there's all different kinds of cables. You have an RCA cable, you have a video cable, this is a stereo cable, this is an XLR cable. You guys have all seen those. All right. Gain structure. Now the most important part. All right. So what is gain structure? Gain structure generally refers to the settings, the proper input to achieve the best signal to noise ratio. And what I mean by signal to noise ratio is if you were to turn the console on, don't have any input coming to it, and you take a fader and you push it all the way up, I guarantee you're going to hear all digital consoles, all analog consoles make noise. All right. So what you want to achieve is a level of gain on your input that minimizes the noise floor, maximizes your input. All right. The ultimate gain is just not turning it up until it's red and the light glows. Gain staging occurs in many places on the sound system. You have gain stage on a microphone. If you have a wireless microphone, that microphone, if you were to open the sleeve, it has a gain stage. You can turn it up or turn it down the dB. So if you have a really loud singer, you can adjust, and they're always on that microphone. You can adjust that system, that microphone, so that it fits their voice. So now you have a gain stage on his amplifier that he's coming out of. We came out of a direct line out of his amplifier into a direct box. That has a certain impedance, that has a certain gain stage coming out of it. Do you use direct boxes at all?
Well,
probably on the acoustic.
It's in there with the pedal.
Okay, so you have what's called a direct box. And the direct box takes his signal and you can push it to where the amplification is at 0, -10, or -20. So if you have to have a pad on it, there's a direct box right there. All right, this
It
is.
also gets rid of hum.
It has, so on a direct box, if you look at it, there's an input and a throughput. So you're going to come in with a 1/4-inch line. You're going to come out to an amplifier, to another system, to something else you want. There's an input here for your XLR output. So 1/4-inch input from guitar, output goes to the system. This one here has a pad on it. If you'll see, it'll say 0, -10, -40. By turning that to, say you have somebody's instrument, say you come in and you're used to your gain structure being like really loud. You're putting out a lot of signal, but his board can't handle it. So he can go to the DI and he can turn it down to -40 and limit the amount of signal you're putting out and going to him. That way your mix sounds better, all right? On the other end of this is called a ground lift. So let me see if I can find this picture. If you see, look on here, there's 3 pins, and I have other drawings of this. There's 3 pins. There's a positive, a negative, and a ground. Sometimes some systems, the grounding is really, really important. When you set up your system, Tim, you need to make sure that your grounding stays constant to the same pin all the way through from there to your console, to your amplifier, and the grounding actually goes out to this building, in your plugs, has a ground rod outside going into the ground. That's where all that hum goes. And most people don't realize that. So your grounding is really important. Sometimes you get instruments. This was a big thing with PV for years. PV decided they didn't like the way the rest of the system or the rest of the country wired their speakers. So almost all XLRs are pin 1 is ground, pin 2 is hot, pin 3 is neutral, all right? PV said, we're not doing that. We're doing pin 3 ground, pin 2 hot, pin 1 neutral. So what happens is every time you plugged in a PV console or an amplifier or anything like that, there was a really bad hum. And they did it intentionally so that you had to buy PV gear with PV amps, with PV consoles. That's no longer the case anymore, but this went on for a lot of years, all right?
You get
So
the same kind of ground loop, not with just your microphone cables, but through your electrical system.
absolutely. So yeah, when we get into cables, we're going to talk about that a little bit more. We're going to talk about talk about ground loops. Like in here, has anybody ever gotten shocked on a microphone? Ever? Okay. So you can get really shocked on a microphone. And it's usually because somebody went and cut the ground lift off the microphone channel. So the way, I should have had a diagram for this, but the way it works is every building is set up electrically with a ground. You guys probably seen your house, outside your house, there's a grounding rod that gets driven into the ground, all right? That's a ground on your house, all right? So anytime you have an electrical issue, say you have a short in the kitchen, or a bathroom, or whatever your short is, that ground has to go somewhere. And it's designed to go outside your house into that grounding rod and into the ground. Same thing with your sound system. If you have a problem with the grounding, it's designed to go through that plug into the little center pin on your plug in the wall, to the wires, to the breaker panel, to that grounding rod in the ground, right? So if you have a problem with grounds, then most likely you're having a problem in the building with grounds. Now, in Florida, I can tell you that it's a big problem. When I took over the technical duties at the crossing, we had grounding problems everywhere. Every day we came in, you know, an air conditioner would kick on, and you could hear it in the sounding system. You could hear, you know, somebody started a popcorn machine. You heard it. Didn't matter. All right, so we went out, we hired an electrical firm to come in, and we started going out to the grounding rod, and we pulled the grounding rod. These ground rods are supposed to be 18 feet in the ground. Our ground rods were 2.5 feet. Why? Because what's very popular in Florida? Lightning. So what happens when lightning hits sand? It turns into glass. What happens to a grounding rod when a copper grounding rod gets attached with lightning and glass? It deteriorates. So a rod that was supposed to be 18 feet into the ground, taking all of the ground in there, was only about this long. So they had to spend thousands of dollars to come in and replace all the grounding rods in the building, all right? So it's just some of the stuff that you guys are going to deal with when you get up there. And it's Sunday morning, and again, you're late, and you plug something in, and there's a hum, and you don't know why there's a hum. So how you can fix that is, you've all seen, you probably have a cheater here. You have the little AC cheaters, the little gray things you buy at Home Depot for 99 cents. You can, if you find out that no matter what you do on the console, no matter what you do on the DI box, you still have a hum, unplug the power source and take away the ground. Typically, that's where your hum's going to come from. They make a little cheater, 99-cent cheater that you lift grounds with. So bypass what you have up here to find out where that ground hum is coming from, okay? This is a typical dialogue or diagram of a channel preamp. So we're going to come off an XLR, and you're going to go to the snake, and the snake's going to take it down to the console, and in the back of the console you're going to plug in the channel. And this is a preamp. I'm not going to get into what all of this stuff does, but this is a typical preamp. And what the preamp is doing is it's taking the signal that's coming in and it's boosting it. It's a pre-amplifier, all right? It's going to boost that signal so the console sees what it wants to see, okay? So this is the first stage of when we get there. What happens with noise floor, what happens when we talk about the channel's really dirty or it's really nasty, is that you got a signal coming in, and your signal is so low coming to this preamp that the preamp can't do its job. And so all you do when you bring up the fader is you're bringing up noise. It's called a noise floor. The more noise floor you have, the worse your channel is going to sound. So by hitting this preamp a little bit harder, by going to that gain knob and turning that gain up to where you're getting more signal into that, you're going to eliminate that noise floor, okay? Here's how gain affects dynamics. So we talked about, okay, now you have a signal coming in, all right? And you've adjusted your gain. You see it on the console. It's just barely getting to the red or the orange. It's not clipping. You've got good gain structure. This is going to go, and it's going to send it all the way down through your all your preamps, your low cuts, your pads, your phase, reversal, all of that kind of stuff is what drives that preamp. And then it's going to drive it all the way down into your links, down to a limiter, down to an A to D converter, and it comes out of the A to D converter and it goes to wherever you decide to send it on your console. All right, so that's your gain structure. That's the, you know, I don't want to get real into the scientific of how that works, but just understand that your gain structure is probably the most important thing. Now, you'll see a lot of old guys like myself who mix. I have a bad habit of, as I'm mixing, I leave all my faders at what are called unity or zero. You guys have all seen zero on a fader, right? I like to get, for something in my head, I need to mix at zero, all right? So I'm constantly going up and tweaking the gain knob to get me to zero. So singer singing, I hit her select on channel. She's not quite there yet. I turn her gain up. The problem with that is, and I'm guilty as anybody, is when you turn that gain knob up, it turns it up across everything in that console. It turns it up in the matrix, it turns it up in the aux sends, it turns it up in the effects, it turns it up in the limiters, it turns it up in the crossover, it turns it up on your output, it turns it up to your DCAs. So where in an analog console you don't have that problem, in a digital console you do. So try to get your gain set where you think it's going to be and leave it there and mix more with your faders. I'm as guilty as anybody. I grabbed the gain thing because I've been mixing on analog consoles for a very, very long time. So I'm trying to break myself of that habit. Here's your signal flow. We got a microphone coming in. It's going into the input gain. Again, the gain stage we talked about. Going through an EQ. Some of the EQs on some of these consoles can be very intense. Some of them, this is just a 3-band EQ, high, mid, and low. Then you have a little meter in here that shows you your channel level, where it's going to. Then you have a mixer output, and then it's going to come out of your output on the mixer, and it's going to go to a set of speakers or front of house speakers or an amplifier, whatever your speakers are being driven by. Most speakers today are powered, so you usually don't have an amplifier. I think you guys do have an amplifier, but most speakers, you just an XLR out of the console to a speaker and you're ready to go. All the crossovers, all the frequencies are controlled within that speaker, all right? So that's signal flow. Anybody have any questions about this at all? This is a really simplified version of it, so. Volume control, different than gain control. You can take and turn your gain up and get volume out of the console, but your volume comes from the faders. So get your gain structure set, and then when you turn up the faders, you're turning up the volume going to the outputs of the console. Using audio meters to adjust it. Every console will have what's called a PFL on it, and that stands for pre-fader level. So it has a set of headphones. And you're going to listen to it. You're going to say, man, that sounds good, that sounds bad. You're going to get used to using your PFL, because that's going to tell you if the signal he's sending you is decent, or it really sounds like crap, or he's got too many effects on it, or he's got too many gain stages on it. Typically, a lot of guitar players will have a whole rack of effects on a board. And every single one of those adds noise to that line. Now, some guitar players handle it really well, and their systems are really quiet. Some I've come into, and it sounds so bad when you're listening to it. So, frequencies and levels, using dynamics correctly. Dynamics meaning limiters, compressors, de-essers, things like that. Some consoles have what are called a de-esser in it, or if you have somebody who's got really high sibilants, you can turn that gain down on the sibilants only. Some compressors that you have on consoles allow you to only pick a certain frequency. So say you have somebody whose voice is really harsh sounding, but the overall gain is okay. You don't want to take the overall gain down. You can pick that frequency that her voice is really harsh at, and you can put a compressor on just that frequency. It'll only squash that frequency without changing the gain or without changing the volume. Okay? Room position and walking the room. Again, where your speaker is pointed, you know, a lot of churches are famous for putting speakers right here, right down the middle of the aisle. Well, we're gonna put it here, so we're gonna cover here and here, but the sweet spot is over here. Well, nobody sits here, so why are you pointing speakers down here? Put your speakers at head level where people sit in the room. Bass traps. We haven't heard bass in this room yet, so what a bass trap is, and I can't imagine you would have, you might have one up there. So what a bass trap is whenever you're playing bass guitar, and all of a sudden you're standing somewhere in the room, and the bass really sounds great. It sounds phenomenal. And you're like, oh, this is what a bass should sound like. And then you walk over here, and you don't even hear the bass. So, like the parabolic microphone, bass frequencies create what's called a trap. And usually, probably in that corner, you're going to hear a little bass trap. You probably might not hear it up here. You definitely will hear one in this hallway back here. So if you're playing bass and you walk in that hallway, it's going to sound like it's all around you. So that's what a bass trap is. In here, it's not a bad thing. There's a lot of churches that I go to. The bass trap is in the audio booth. All right. So the audio guy's in there and he's mixing. Man, this bass sounds great today. It is thumping. I feel the bottom. It's low end. I love it. And then he walks out and he walks in the middle of the room, and you don't hear the bass at all. So what do you have to do? You have to mix for that. So you have to know that where you're sitting and mixing, the bass has to be a lot hotter than it is in the room in order for you to get a better balance in the room. Okay? Remember, we talked about this. We talked about being the Levites. We talked about you're here to serve. This is your job. This is what you do on Sundays. All right? Be ready to serve. Get ready to come in here and do your very best. That's what God demands. That's what God expects. So be prepared to serve. Impedance. This is a little tricky subject for that. We're not going to spend a lot of time on it. So anytime you have a microphone, not so much today as it was maybe 10 years ago, microphones are made with different impedances. So the impedance is a way that the sum of all the square roots and resistance. So the best way to explain it, a cable you have a piece of copper cable, all right? And if it's the thickness of my pinky, it has one resistance. If it's the thickness of my thumb, it has a completely different resistance. The amount of resistance is measured in ohms, all right? So as you do ohms and as you go through this, the amount of resistance in every instrument, his guitar player has a different resistance than a microphone does. Impedance is being able to match whatever's coming out of that instrument or that microphone to your console. We're not going to spend a lot of time on it because you guys probably don't have to deal with that at all in here. It's usually over very long runs of cable where the impedance becomes a problem. Back in the 70s and 80s, you guys may have one here in the church. You had a microphone that had a quarter-inch adapter on it, had a quarter-inch plug on it. It was an XLR that went to quarter-inch. Well, they were physically changing the impedance of that microphone so that the microphone would work. They didn't want to spend the money to develop really good microphones, so that's how Radio Shack decided to get into the market. And they made a quarter-inch to XLR adapter that allowed you to use really, really cheap garbage microphones on a sound system. Cables. Now the fun part. All right, I teach this in college, and I'll tell you what, this is as important as that chart that I gave you with the keyboards. All right, cables will make or break you. The way you handle cables will make or break you. I can guarantee you right now that if I went back into that room and and looked under that console. Nothing's labeled. So why is that important? So we have a storm outside, and it's lightning, and the power goes off, and it takes something out, and you have to find out where that something is. Without cables labeled, without cables knowing what cables do and how they're put together and how they're connected to your console, you have no way to figure it out. And you'll spend an hour digging around in a mess, in a rat's nest, that a little bit of 5 minutes of labeling would have taken care of. All right? We're going to talk about the different kinds of cables. This is an XLR. You guys all see them. You guys use them here. This is resistance. We talked about resistance a little bit. We talked about how resistance works. Resistance going through a cable, going through a microphone. The ohm ratio, also known as impedance. It's basically the same thing. So resistance, I put that in there because I thought it was a clever, resistance is futile. Who knows where that's from? There you go. Okay, so you all too young. It's the resistance of electrical quantity that measures from the device and the material reduces the electronic current. It's physically changing the amount of current that flows through an item. The resistance is measured in units of ohms. If we make an analogy to water flow like you did with your pipes, all right, when you talked about the water flow outside of a fire extinguisher, or a fire hydrant, excuse me, to water flow in pipes, the resistance is bigger when the pipe is thinner. So you all know that if you take a garden hose and you put your thumb over the end of it when it's spraying, there's more pressure. Right? Same thing with audio. If you squash the signal in resistance electronically, there's more signal. Okay? Length of cables is important, and why that is, not so much here. So when you guys run your amps here, so you have an amplifier, I'm assuming, in the back, okay? And you're running copper cable up through the wall, through the ceiling, or in the floor, up to these speakers, all right? The length of that cable determines how much resistance there is in those speakers. Most amplifiers use 4 ohms or 8 ohms, all right? That's their setup resistance. If you took that same speaker and that same amplifier and say you put 6 speakers on that same load, every time you add ohms to that load, it reduces it. So this could be an 8 ohm speaker, and then if you put 2 on it, now it's a 4 ohm speaker. If you put 4 speakers on it, now it's a 2 ohm speaker, all right? Basically, you've created a welding machine. You're sending 2 ohms of electricity to these speakers that aren't meant to have that. They're meant to have 8 ohms. So basically, you could use that as a welder. So that's why it's important that you know. Also, the distance is important because the 2 cables going to these, if you're running stereo, they need to be exactly the same length. Because if one's a little bit tighter, curled up in a coil somewhere, and one's running directly to it, the resistance is differently. The speaker's going to act different. It's going to sound different. So when you run power through amplifiers to speakers, resistance is important. Today, most speakers are powered already. They have an amplifier built in the speaker, not somewhere else. So that's not really a big issue. All you're doing is sending signal down to it. Wow. The size of the wiring is important, whether it's solid or stranded. If who's ever worked in a house, who's ever worked on putting in a plug in a house, all right? The cable that comes to the wall is usually hardcore, solid core, right? They call it Romex, they call it, whatever you want to call it. Electrical circuitry needs more resistance, so the cords and the cables are thicker, they're solid copper. In signal and audio, all of your cables are braided. You don't need as much resistance. They achieve the resistance they need by taking and curling copper in a braid, and then usually surrounding it by a core, and then covering it with a foil to protect it from outside effects. All right, so that's why you'll see when we start going through some of this stuff, electric stuff is always solid copper, audio signal stuff is always braided. Shielding. Shielding is really important in where you go. We're talking back about grounding again. So I've seen where people come in and they hang a microphone from their ceilings. And they use the cheapest cable they can find because the church budget wasn't that high that month and they couldn't afford it, and they found 65 feet of cable laying in a room somewhere, and they put it in the ceiling, and guess what? As soon as they hook up that microphone, what do you think happens? Any idea?
It's hanging from it pinches the cable if it's hanging.
It's an antenna. And I've been in buildings where somebody hung a microphone off a cable and it picked up the local radio station. All right, so again, when you go to cheap cable, you end up paying for it, right? So that's why I talk about whenever you're going into cable, I tell all the churches that I consult with, spend most of your money on cable. Spend most of your money on electricity, on electrical cable, because those are the things that are going to bury us. You know, like right now, all this lightning out there right now could come in here and could follow. And I've seen this where churches, you know, they have big lighting rigs. They have a lot of lights up there. Lightning hits the outside tree out there. It comes through the ground, comes in the ground. It's not supposed to. Comes through the electrical panel, follows the point of least resistance, goes up and hits that LED light that's up there and blows it up. Right? Happens every week. Happens all the time. Cable. It's really, really important. All right. Cable coiling. When you take coil, especially large electrical coil, like if you're wiring a house or something like that, and you coil it up, what does it create? Anybody know? What's that? It twists, but it also creates an electronic field. So when you coil cable up, especially speaker cable, so you're running out of that amplifier, and you've got 25 feet too much cable. So what do? You coil that cable up underneath the desk over there, or you coil it up here in the ceiling, and there's 25 feet more cable sitting up there. That's creating an electronic field around that cable, which can throw off smoke detectors, can throw off Wi-Fi, can throw off lighting, absolutely. So you only cut your cable to your length that you need. Don't leave it spooled up, all right? If you go to a concert, if you go to guys that do this professionally, they do what's called a figure eight. So when you lay cable on a floor, like usually they're pushing big, honking three-phase cables. You guys have always seen that kind of stuff. They'll roll them in a figure eight on the floor because now you've shrunk the amount of field that's coming out of that cable only to the point where they touch. Instead of it being on top of each other, it's only where they touch is where that electronic field is created. All right. Room temperature affects cables. We've all worked with cables that are cold. They're very brittle. You got to let them get acclimated. If you go outside and you're doing an outside event on the youth pad and you got speakers going and it's sunny and it's 104 in Florida out there, and then you bring them in here and they get cold really, really fast, they get really, really brittle inside. And somebody comes in and they throw them all in a pile here because it started to rain. We got to break this stuff down. They bring it in and they throw them in a pile, and then somebody grabs them. They start wrapping them around their arm. First of all, if you see that happen, slap the person hard. I mean, you never roll a cable around your arm. It's never done. But temperature will make your cables very brittle, and it takes the length of them out. Typically, if you roll your cable like an XLR cable, like a mic cable, if you roll it up properly, you can get 8 or 10 years out of a microphone cable. If you roll it up improperly, you probably get about 1.5 to 2 years out of them. Now, not seem like a lot until you have to buy 100 cables a year at $29 a piece. So now you're spending $2,900 every 2 years versus every 10 years or 8 years. It becomes important. I keep hitting the wrong button again. %of all the cables, all the problems related by cable, cheap cables, label. I was working for Reba McEntire. I was touring with Reba right before the plane crash that she had. And we were in a concert in Phoenix, Arizona. A couple $1 million with PA, $2 million with the lighting, 80,000 people in an arena. 15 minutes before the show starts, some idiot decides they need to put more chairs down in the front of the concert venue and picks up a forklift and drives over a Cat 5 cable and takes the whole entire system down, right? Because he drove over a cable. Cables will always be the weak link in anything that you do, so protect them. If you guys are outside doing something for youth, or you're in the youth building, or you're in here and you need to run a cable, put a carpet over it, put something over it that people are going to walk, because people are going to walk on them. They don't care. They don't know the importance of them. So cover them up. Take care of your cables, all right? Because eventually they'll crash. Labels. Again, we talked about going underneath there. You're only going to need to find out what that label is in an emergency. You're never going to want to know what that label is on Tuesday afternoon. It's always Sunday, 5 minutes before service starts. Service is starting to go. I can't hear the wireless mic. Why can't I hear the wireless mic? I can't see if it's working. I don't know. Maybe the cable went bad. Let's crawl under the desk and find the cable. And it's not labeled. Guess what? Now it's a half an hour. And pastor's up here going, okay, what are we doing? What are we doing? What's going on? Forget about it. We're just going to preach out loud. And now you're just sitting back there twiddling your thumbs because you didn't have your act together. This is the different types of cabling. There's literally a couple hundred different types of cable out there. And using the right cable for the right reason is really, really important. Some of this stuff is 4-conductor, steel braided, shielded, plenum cable. Again, 3-conductor. This is what some of the typical stuff that you have. Here's a different kind of shielding and braiding out here. This is all mostly signal cable. Again, we talk about the braids. These are braided cables. This is typically what you find in your house. This is the electrical cable you find in your house. Here's some of the same stuff, but it's braided. We all see the plugs. We've all seen the different kind of plugs that we have, molded plugs, the different kinds of adapters that you use, different kind of plug-ins and outs. Use the right, one of the things that is really important, if you're going to make extension cords because you got to put something else on the stage and you need to run power up there. It's really easy to go to Home Depot and buy the cheapest plug you can get because it's cheap. I need 12 male plugs, and at Home Depot they're $9.68 a piece. A real good one's going to be $22 a piece, and you say, I'm going to save the money, I'm just going to put the $9 one in there. You got to put the plug in that matches what you're doing. I just did a lighting install this weekend, and they sent somebody out to buy plugs. We're using 10-gauge wire to run extension cords. Now, 10-gauge extension cord wire is really thick, all right? But we were running 208 power about 100 feet, so it needed to be heavy. Well, he went and bought these cheap $9.30 plugs, which we couldn't use. We had to send him back to buy the right plugs, to buy the 20 amp or 25 amp plug that we could use to make these extension cords so that it would fit the wiring that we had. And what ended up happening? We lost 2 hours of time because this guy had to run back to Home Depot because he didn't buy the right plug at the right time. Buy the right plugs for the right system that you're going to use. If you're going to run a cable 100 feet, don't use a 15 amp plug. It should be a 20 amp plug. Use at least a 14 gauge or 12 gauge wire in it so that it can handle the resistance. As you run a cable, if you feel like you run a cable 100 feet in here and you pick it up at the end, you're going to notice it's warm. You pick it up and you're like, why is this cable warm? Well, that's the electricity, that's the resistance of the cable. That's what's happening. And as those plugs keep getting warmer and warmer and warmer and colder and warmer and colder and unplugged and plugged in, they're going to break down. The shielding will break down, the jacket will break down, and eventually they'll fail. All right? Why? We talked about these different plugs. This is an RCA plug, 1/4-inch stereo jack, XLR. These are some of the IT cables that you'll see. I just put in about 1,400 foot of this cable right here this weekend. This is fiber cable. Fiber cable is becoming the now thing, especially in audio, where it's a bigger bandwidth. You can run, if you guys know anything about doing computers and stuff, a typical cable like that will run 1,000 gigabits of information through it, where normal cable will run about 150 gigabits. So depending on the wires that you need, this is a spliced section of fiber cable. It actually shows the core. It actually has light going through it. That's what the fiber is. It's a light-based cable. Cat 5, typical RJ45 end. That's a typical end for the fiber cable. These are some of the other things that you'll see. HDMI cable. That's what I'm using right here, right now. That's what's going to this TV. A molded HDMI cable. You guys have all used them. Y'all have game machines. You know what HDMI is. S-Video. 110 years old. Nobody uses S-Video anymore. And I guarantee if you go into a closet here, there's S-Video.
Yeah, I can go get one.
And there's probably a VCR still blinking 12 o'clock that goes to it.
Yeah.
So
We got a VGA too.
yeah, VGA, this stuff is pretty much dead. All of this stuff is pretty much dead. DVI, components, sometimes in professional installations like restaurants, components still used, but not much. Composite, almost never. This is more HDMI. This is SDI cable or coax cable. Coax is becoming a standard also for audio now, which is starting to change out because it's a thicker core and you can transfer more information. As we go digital, the more we transfer, the faster our speeds, the less latency we have. So the better cable you have, the less latency you end up winding up with. So what's going on right now, what you're going to probably end up doing when we start putting your Cat 6 in here to pull to your stage box, all right? Cat 5 transfers at a certain gigabit. Cat 6 transfers at about 60% more gigabit. So you want to use the fastest gigabit that you can. Then there's Cat 6A, which is made for install underground kind of stuff, which will handle even more, but it's really hard to work with. It's really, really stiff. But SDI, typically, this is a video cable, runs from your camera back to wherever your switcher is. This can run up to 300 meters or 900 feet without any signal loss at all. So that's what people use that stuff for video for. The different kind of connectors and the different kind of usage, I guarantee all of this is in play in this building at some place. All the different DB connectors, all the multi-connectors, the ends of VGA, there's the serial ports, all that kind of stuff. So you got to kind of know what these are. You can tell what you have in here. When you have a mini plug, you have TRS. TRS means tip ring sleeve. It's very important. His guitar has single mono tip ring sleeve right here that he plugs his instrument into. This is the same as this, except it's stereo. So you can get two different signals out of that tip ring sleeve on that one. XLR, RCA, we all have seen RCA. We plug our VCRs in, our DVD players, they all have RCA into them. USB, anybody not use USB? Firewire, gone. Nobody uses it anymore. Was a big thing for a while. ADAT, specifically designed for digital audio recording technology. And it's made for running multi-tracks of like 8 or 10 tracks of audio at one time. I'm not going to spend a whole lot more time on it. I just wanted you guys to see kind of the stuff that's out there. Again, going back to using what you need for the job that you need to have. All right, this is really, really important. So when the pastor says, we want to put a new TV up, but can we run a VGA cable to it? And you'd say, absolutely not. We don't run VGA anymore. That was 100 years ago. So what are we going to run? So how are we going to get signal from wherever your switcher is up to that TV? You can run HDMI, but HDMI is only meant to run 25 feet. Anything over that, you can't run HDMI. So what everybody's doing now is they're taking Cat 6 and they're doing Cat 6 extenders. You have a Cat 6 on one end that takes the signal and a Cat 6 on the other end, a little box, and you can transfer up to 1,000 feet of Cat 6 from one TV, from one input to the TV. So most of your feeds and stuff like that, if they're HDMI, you should consider running just Cat 6 extenders. Fiber is becoming the next new thing as far as that goes. But fiber is still fairly expensive. Again, the end of the plugs, we don't need to go over there. We saw Okay, here's your pinouts. Remember we talked about how PV made different pinouts. This is a typical setup for a pinout. You have a male pin and you have a female pin. You notice every one of them numbered. If you end up making cables, and I suggest you all learn how to make a cable, you learn how to solder a cable, just match up the numbers. 1 to 1, 2 to 2, 3 to 3. All right, as long as you stay with that, you're going to be fine. But understand when you lift them up, notice how they're opposite. 3 is always going to be in the center, 2 is always that way. When you're wiring tip-ring sleeve for this as a stereo plug, it shows you exactly where to wire those plugs to go to XLR. Again, here's your configuration of what they look like. This is a 4-pin. This is typically DMX. That's mostly used for lighting. And actually, in real life, it's a 5-pin, not 4-pin. So DMX stands for demuxing. It's a long term that just says converting analog to digital or signal cable to digital. Lighting uses demuxing. But you can take this cable, and so this standard came out by the lighting engineers about 1980. And everybody in the country was supposed to go to 5-pin DMX. Well, nobody wanted to pay for 5-pin DMX because a 5-pin connector is really expensive. So they were like, well, and the idea is that for right now, we're only going to use 3 of these pins, and the other 2 pins, as technology grows, we're going to use those other 2 pins. Well, the technology never grew. And so we have a lot of stuff, like a lot of lighting stuff, that has 5-pin on the end of it, but you're only running 3 plugs on it. So everybody's like, why am I buying 5-pin XLRs that cost $19 a piece when I can buy a $1.95 3-pin and I'm only using 3-pin? So that's kind of where it's gone to right now. Most of the stuff for audio or for lighting is going to fiber because it's so much faster. But this is a typical turnaround for 3-pin to 5-pin. You can buy these all day long at Home Depot. You can buy them at Lowe's. You can buy them at Full Compass. They make a turnaround already so that you don't have to make them. They're like $12.
Can you they always say, I've always heard them say like, no, you don't. But
you can.
DMX for an XLR,
It's the same exact thing.
Same thing.
It's the same exact cable strength, same exact braid. There's no difference. They tell you don't, and they tell you don't because those people want you to buy the 5-pin. Now, some gear.
All ours are 3.
Yeah, some gear have only 5-pin. So Ahava Lights makes a big lighting chain. All of theirs is 5-pin. So every time I put an Ahava Light system, I have to buy a little 3 to 5 adapter and spin it around. And all it is 5 pins wired to 3. That's all it is. You can make them all day long. Okay, before we go into this, we're going to take a little bit of break. All right, get yourself something to drink, and we'll get ready to get into some microphone techniques and things like that. Okay. I don't, probably. You got a hot date?
Kind of. Bible study.
And yeah, what game are you playing?
Is this